Welcome to episode 224 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing screenwriter Rob Tobin, whose film Get Married or Die was recently produced. Rob gives a great, inspiring interview. He's a guy that toiled on the edges of screenwriting for 25 years and has finally broken through. He's a guy who worked a day job for many years, all while trying to write as well. So we talk about that whole experience, his experience working a day job, writing on the side, how he was just persistent, and eventually he did break in. And now he is earning his full-time living as a screenwriter. So again, just a great inspirational story. So stay tuned for that interview. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking or sharing it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode number 224. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide. I'll teach you how to write a professional logline and query letter and how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. Really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I am interviewing screenwriter Rob Tobin. Here is the interview. Welcome, Rob, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So to start out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and how did you get interested in the entertainment business and screenwriting?
Well, I'm actually Canadian. I was born in Nova Scotia, which is just above New England, but I was raised about 400 miles north of Toronto. Surprisingly, just about 40 or 60 miles away from James Cameron was where he was born and raised.
Huh.
And I came down to the States, I guess, in about 1989, and then came over to, that was to Iowa, and then I came to finish my master's degree in professional writing at USC in 90, and that's when I actually started doing screenwriting.
Okay, perfect. And what were some of the first steps you took to actually turn it into a career? Did you write some specs? Did you send them out? Did you get an option? Maybe talk about some of the early days of your career and kind of how you got a foothold.
Well, you know, I have to tell you, the first thing, probably the most remarkable thing about my screenwriting career is that it took me 25 years to sell my first screenplay.
Huh.
And everybody always laughs at that, and then they pat me on the back and congratulate me for an incredible and human perseverance.
Uh-huh.
But it took me a long time because I think I did things maybe not the wrong way. I did the writing the right way. I persevered. I spent every second I could during my writing. I wrote and rewrote and did all the things read all the right books and did all the things you're supposed to. But I got sidetracked by becoming a development exec in the film industry, and I thought that would somehow get me, first a living, because it's hard to make a living just off screenwriting, and second, I thought it would get me the kind of contacts that I would need for it, but it turned out that the kind of contacts I got were really not interested in me so much as, more screenwriters with a better track record. So it just took me a long time, but I persevered. After many years, finally got to the point where my scripts were starting to finish high and even win some major competitions and get me some buzz. And then finally, along the way, I did get some screenwriting assignments some of them were quite lucrative, and I was almost making a living, but not quite. And then I finally sold a script that got produced.
Okay, perfect. And on IMDb, you mentioned, on IMDb page, it lists a number of short films. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit. How did those help your career? And would you encourage people screenwriters to write shorts and produce shorts?
Yeah, they didn't. I'm not sure how much they really helped my career because, to be honest, and surprisingly, I actually sold a feature film before I sold the shorts. Um, but I will say, though, that the one short, Broken, probably had the most effect on me, and that was because it was done as part of one of those 48-hour contests where you assemble an entire crew and you have to do everything within 48 hours, shoot a, it's usually around 5 or 6 minute film. We did a 6 minute film, and you have to do everything within 48 hours, which sounds, well, it's a 6 minute film. How hard could it be? Oh, my God. It was life-changing because although I'd been on set many times as a development exec and also having friends who shot both TV and film, to be actually part of that incredible rush for 48 hours to get something not just shot, you had to write it, cast it, find a location, get everything, get the set all done up, shoot the thing, do the sound, the editing, the music. It was astonishing. It was astonishing. Excuse me, I'll just have to shut this off here. Okay, yeah, so I think that more than anything really made me aware of, I think it added to my writing tremendously because I realized that, every line somebody has to not just say, but shoot and light and get the sound right for it and shoot it many, many times in order to get it right. Every word has a cost in a production in terms of time and money. And especially when it's all condensed like this, it really made me hyper aware of that. And I think my writing got even leaner and more, I think, considerate toward the production people.
Yeah, perfect. So let's just talk briefly about that first sale that you had. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you were able to get that sale. Was it query letters? Was it through an agent? Was it through a contact? How did that sale come to be?
Well, I think the first thing that I did that allowed me to get that sale was that I sat down after it was at that time, I guess it was about 23 years or so that I'd gone and I made some good money from screenwriting, but I'd never actually sold my own spec script. And of course, selling a spec script is one of the most demanding and challenging things you can do in the film industry because usually most production companies and studios are really looking towards veteran writers and they get writing assignments that they give to these writers. And there are only, maybe 50 or 60 spec scripts that are sold in a year in the entire market. And whereas, there might be thousands of them, tens of thousands, maybe even at 50 or 100,000 written in a year, maybe 50 or 60 scripts of those scripts get sold to a studio or a production company. Now, a lot of those get done independently, small handheld kind of thing. But if you're talking about making money from a spec script, it's extraordinarily difficult. So I finally, sat myself down and I thought to myself, well, what do I need to do in order to finally get a producer be willing to commit that amount of money to an unknown writer? And I thought, well, what I need to do is reduce the amount of money. And so what I did was I intentionally sat down and wrote what at that time the script was called Storefront. I wrote a script that could be done in one location, a small location with no special effects, a small cast of maybe 3 or 4 people, and done for maybe $100,000. And within weeks of writing that script, it was optioned. Unfortunately, it took a little while for it to be optioned by the right producers because it was optioned 3 or 4 times by producers who just didn't have the juice to do it. And then I finally read an ad on a film site saying looking for a $100,000 film. And I applied. They loved the script, and it went from there.
Okay, perfect. And how did you get some of those other options? Were those similar things where you're just on some of these sites submitting?
Yeah, I probably took too long to do it, but basically what my approach was that over the years, I just increased the size of my network, film industry network, and I just kept increasing it and increasing and networking, pitching, all the time. And again, I think I did a lot of things wrong because I should have been able to do it in a much shorter period of time. I'm not saying to anyone out there that it's going to take 25 years. 10 years is probably average, though, to be realistic. It is that hard to sell a spec script in Hollywood. But it was even harder for me because I think I was, I was holding down a day gig, raising a family, trying to make my way in the film industry, and also writing on the side. And it's a tough gig, and I respect anybody who does it for sure. And for me, what I did finally was I just kept pitching everything that I could, submitting to contests. And now, of course, you have a lot of online pitches that you can do. You can do written pitches and online pitches directly to producers. And it's a lot easier now than it was then. Trying to get into a producer's office back then was just, it was brutal. And usually what you found was, because when I came here, I was already in my mid-30s when I came to LA. I found that, there were 12-year-olds behind the desk, or it would seem like it to somebody who was in their mid-30s. And more than once, I just heard the word old. They would just come right out and say, it's a young market. We can't have older writers writing for it. And it would be that blatant. So for me, it was just a matter of persistence and just pitching all the time. But to back that up a bit, the most important thing I did was, and the thing that I learned to do even more as I grew older and further into my career, was that I made sure that I never, ever sent anything out that I was not sure was the very best thing I could do. Hemingway has a great saying, I can't quote it exactly, but he said, the first draft of anything is poo-poo. That's not the word Hemingway would use, but and he's right. And I think that the nice thing is that when you are submitting, although there may be thousands of other people submitting, you can know for sure that the vast majority of them have not done the amount of work that you have if you do the work.
So why do you think you had this light bulb moment after 23 years where you said, I'm just going to write a low budget script? What changed, or what happened that you just had that moment? Because I get a lot of emails from people, and I often wonder, because I preach this advice on the podcast every week, write something low budget. That's your best chance of getting something. And I'll get emails from people, oh, my scripts are more in the $5 to $10 million, $50 million. I don't have any small ideas. Why do you think you had that light bulb moment at that particular moment that all of a sudden, hey, let's write something that could be produced more easily?
Right. Well, I think it was cumulative based on the fact that you started around me. I started to see, especially low-budget horror films, screenplays starting to get produced, and some of them doing extraordinarily well, of course. Starting with, of course, the Blair Witch Project, but then moving forward to everything, all of the ones that off the top of my head I can't remember now, but they just kept getting produced and doing well. And it just finally, I guess, being a tough-headed Canadian, it took me a long time thinking that, no, if you write well enough, and that's one of the myths, by the way, that I don't like hearing in town, which is if you write well enough, somebody will find your script. No, they won't. The odds are against you, and I know that sounds negative, but I think it's important that if you are going to jump across a gap in a cliff, for instance, from one side of the canyon to another, I think you need to know how far it really is. I think you need to know what your chances are of succeeding. And I think it's the same thing with screenwriting. I think if people come into this industry thinking that quality alone will do it, or I'll get lucky, or if I'm good looking, they'll like me, or whatever it is, it's just the fact that it's an incredibly demanding, challenging profession, and that the vast, vast majority of people will never make a living off of it. I can tell you that I've made as much as $250,000 a year from it, but it took me 25 years to get to that point. And although again that may be atypical, it's not. I'm not the only one who's done that. And I think in the majority of cases, it's not that it takes 25 years to make it; it's that you never do make it.
Yeah. So, and this is more of a philosophical question, and I'm going to ask it of you because I ask it of myself all the time, and I'm just curious to hear your answer. Why do you do it? At the end of the day, because I ask myself this, I look at the scripts that I've sold, and I wonder if the amount of effort I put into it has really been worth the rewards I've gotten out of it. And it's a hung jury with me. I'm honestly not sure, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts. Is all the effort, the 25 years to get these sales and some of these writing assignments, has it been worth it? And if so, why? Why is it worth it to you?
Well, I'm not sure that's the way that I would look at it in terms of worth or value, simply because of this. I started writing stories when I was 3 years old. I started writing short stories actually when I was 3 years old. For me, it was always part of who I was. That's not necessarily the case for everyone, of course, But it's kind of like, you look at Tiger Woods and he was hitting a golf ball 100 yards when he was like 3 years old or something. Of course, he was driven by his dad and all that. I don't know how much of it was from him, but for me, my dad never drove me. He was a gold miner in northern Canada, and all he knew is that he wanted me to get a government job because that was safe and secure. And I loved him for it because he'd been through the depression, and he knew how hard the world was, and he loved me enough to want me to not be a writer, to want to make a living and support a family and be happy. And to him, that's what that was. For me, it was at 3 years old, started writing stories, and I just never stopped. And so in a way, although it took me 25 years of screenwriting to sell a script, I was actually writing since I was 3. So for me, there was never a choice. It's kind of almost for me like being an addict, I guess. But I like to think it's a positive thing. But because it was always a part of me, it was never a question in my mind. Was it worth it? Because I didn't have a choice anyway. And what I often tell, because I teach screenwriting classes, and I'm oftentimes flown everywhere, south of France, East Coast, San Francisco, to give talks on screenwriting. And the first thing I always tell everybody is, do it because you love it, because the odds of actually making a living from it are very, very small. And if you're looking at it in monetary terms, going, what's the best thing for me to do? Spend 4 or 5 years in law school, and you'll come out and probably be able to make a 6-figure income, fairly quickly, and have something that you can depend on for the rest of your life, if that's what you're looking at. If you're looking, and so it's kind of hard for me. I don't want to say that if you ask the question, you shouldn't be writing, because that's fatuous. But I would say that if you do have doubts, you should listen to them, because it may be that maybe it's not the right thing for you to do. And certainly if you're doing it for any reason other than passion, unless you are one of those brilliant people that sell, their first script, one of those rat bastards, that's fine. That's fine. But otherwise, it's just going to be a long haul. And I think on average, I've seen figures that it takes about 10 screenplays before the average screenwriter who gets produced does get produced. That's a long, that's school. That's school plus graduate school plus postgraduate school. It's like getting a PhD. So if you're not willing to sit down and get a PhD in physics or psychology, then you're probably not willing to sit down and get a PhD in screenwriting.
Yeah. So sound advice. So let's dig into your latest film, Get Married or Die. Maybe to start out, you can just give us a log line or pitch for that film.
An old man walks into a small one-man travel agency, pulls out a gun, holds it on the one person, the one-man owner who's there, and says, I want you to get your next female client to marry you, or I'll kill you both.
Okay, perfect. So where did this idea come from? What's sort of the genesis of it?
Well, it was, for me, unlike probably any of my scripts before then, I was really very methodical about it, because once I had decided that I was going to write $100,000 movie, unlike a high concept movie or a movie that was inspired by a place or a person or a line or a condition or a political situation or any of those things that usually at least inspire me to write a screenplay, it was inspired by almost mechanics. How do I write this screenplay? And I started to do a checklist. And it was like, well, first thing, of course, is it's got to be 1 or 2 locations at the most. Now, it turned out after I'd written the first version of the script, many drafts, of course, but once I'd written the first version of the script, it all took place within that little travel shop, travel agency inside a mall. And when people were coming in, it was shot from inside. When people were in, they stayed in there, and all of the drama happened within there. There was gunshots and a fight and all of the things that could happen in a space just big enough to accommodate it. And there was about, I think, 4 characters at that point in the script. Once the final producers who actually bought the script as opposed to just optioning it, once they began to work with me, they convinced me to create scenes outside of the travel agency and to kind of take away from the claustrophobic feel of the script. So I started adding, started taking some of what happened originally in the script and putting it outside, but also adding scenes as backstory that occurred outside of the store, the storefront, the store, to add depth to the story. And so it kind of evolved that way. But for me, it was very much, okay, well, where do I set it? And so once I realized, well, what one location can I set this thing in and have it be interesting? And I thought, well, it has to be a location small. It has to be easy to furnish. It has to be a place where people would naturally come in and out of. A bedroom in a home might not be a place where people would come in and out of and, logically build up tension and add new characters and so forth. So I thought, well, maybe a commercial location, maybe a small place in the mall. So that was the process. It was almost like I was a line producer or a studio accountant kind of going, well, how can we save money here? And it's funny because originally the script was in a travel agency, and when the producers were looking for location, and remember they had a $100,000 budget, which unless you're familiar with the film industry, you may not realize how infinitesimally small that really is. It's like, you can barely burp on a $100,000 on screen on that kind of budget. So they looked and they actually found the only place they could find was a small church basement. And they found that it wasn't right for a travel agency, so they made it a photo studio. So it ended up being that it wasn't a travel agency at all, but it was a guy who did travel photos. So most of the script could be maintained as it was, as somebody, because I had a travel theme where people would come in, and it kind of had a symbolism of people going on their final journeys. And that's what the old man was. He's going in on his final journey in a lot of ways. And if things go wrong, the people in the store may actually be going with him. So I liked it that it was a travel agency. But it was only after I picked the travel agency that I realized that there was an opportunity to create that parallel symbolism of people physically going into a travel agency and people maybe coming in for their final journey of their life, or at least traveling in a new direction, which I really liked. And they were able to maintain it with the Photoshop.
Okay, perfect. So let's talk about your writing process a little bit, and we can talk specifically about Get Married or Die, but we can talk in more general sense as well. How much time do you spend preparing to write, doing the outlining and that kind of stuff, as opposed to opening up Final Draft and actually writing?
I am, I'm horribly addicted to structure. I've even written screenwriting books, fairly well-known screenwriting books on structure, and that's my main thing. I'm not saying that that's it for everyone, and I'm not saying that every single screenplay. I have written one or two screenplays where I just kind of sat down and felt the urge and started to write. But even those screenplays, I then had to go through and fix the structure, add a structure, whatever. But for me, it begins with, there are about, half a dozen or so major elements that I look at. And whichever one of those elements has inspired me to write that particular script. So if I'm sitting in a restaurant and I hear an interesting conversation or see an interesting character walk in, and I go, okay, well, it's the concept, it's the character, it's the situation, it's the location, whatever it is. I go, that's where I'm starting. Now, how do I build it? And for me, it's almost like building blocks. Well, given this, let's say it's a character. Given this character, what would be an interesting context, location, situation to place that character in? And if I decide that, then I go, well, who else can inhabit that space that would cause friction with him, that could perhaps bond with him, oppose him, and so forth? So yeah, for me, it's very much a Lego kind of situation where I build it from the ground up. And I may never know until it happens which of the main characteristics of the play, the main elements of the play, will start me off. But once I have that, it gives me my first step. And then I look to really create the relationships within the script and the characters within the script and the settings that kind of act like characters. And I just build out from there. Once I have that, it kind of evolves into a treatment rather than a synopsis, because I kind of end up doing like an actual treatment. And in film industry, the literal definition of a treatment is a short description of every single scene in the script. A lot of people mistake that for a synopsis, and I end up doing I build the scenes and I build them and I build them and I build them. Then once I have a really full treatment, for me, it's like, add water and you're done. For me, it's like add dialogue and I'm done. Once I have maybe about 15, 20 pages of this really detailed treatment for the script, I then go in, put it into, I take it from Word, put it into Final Draft, I just pour it in, and then I just start writing.
And how long does that take you typically to just finish up once you're to that just add water stage?
Wow,
you can write the draft.
Everything is story dependent. Everything. Two things. First, it depends on what I'm doing in my life at that time. The last script I wrote, which is actually just got sold in Canada to a Canadian producer, and they've got a $4.5 million budget for it and a director attached, and it's full speed ahead. I wrote that one while I was working 60 miles from my home, about 60 miles from my home, and I was commuting in Southern California traffic every day. So what I did was I actually got up at 3:30 every morning and drove to the city where I was working and spent 2 hours every day in a Starbucks writing before going to work. And I was working as a tech writer. So I would write screenplays for 2 to 3 hours, go to work 8 hours a day writing tech manuals, training manuals, and maintenance manuals, and then drive home. And because I was driving home in traffic, it would take me 2 to 3 hours to drive home. So I did that for about a year and a half. And one of the scripts I wrote during that time, as I said, has just gotten sold. And another one that I wrote during that time is actually is being considered seriously by a couple of producers. So it really depends how long, because in that time, it took me a long time to write things because it was 2 hours a day, and the exhaustion of waking up at 3 o'clock, because I'd go to bed maybe at 10 or 11 o'clock. So I was getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep a day, and it was brutal. At other times, since I quit and have become a full-time screenwriter, I can do a screenplay in 2 months.
Yeah. So what is your writing schedule like now? Yeah, now let's talk about that. Now that you are a full-time screenwriter, what does your writing schedule look like now? Do you write for 12 hours a day? Do you try and pace yourself out? What does a typical day look like?
Well, because I've been doing it for so long and I have such a backlog of scripts, I actually find that a lot of my time is taken up with marketing. So I'll sit down, and because I have such a vast online network of film industry people, the number of emails I get in a day is just overwhelming. So it could take me 2 hours of sitting down or standing up, because I have one of those stand-up desks. It could take me 2 hours just to get through my emails and just to find out, who's interested, who wants a script, who wants a meeting, who may be asking me to help them with their script and so forth, and going through all of those. And then also included in that is going through all the film sites, looking for any postings for screenwriters. Because even if you're making $250,000 a year, which is not every year for me, but it has happened, even then, it's because you're a freelancer, you go from assignment to assignment. Or script to script, and even if you sell a script for, if you're lucky, $60,000, $70,000, if you wrote the script 3 years ago and you spread that over 3 years, it's not a lot. So you're like a shark. I kind of compare screenwriters to sharks. You have to keep moving. You have to keep moving. You have to keep pitching projects you have. You have to keep putting yourself out there for assignments for other people's scripts, and either writing from concept or rewrites, polishes, and all that kind of stuff. So your day is taken up probably in a 12-hour day. Maybe 8 hours of that is taken up with what I call business, but necessary business. And then maybe about 4 hours, if I'm lucky, actually writing a new screenplay. Because it's funny, because the more successful you get, the more your own spec screenplays kind of get pushed aside, because you're always doing either an assignment for someone else or you're looking for an assignment. And like the first script I ever sold, which was Get Married or Die, I only made $3,000 from. And because a $100,000 script, unless you're lucky and it's Blair Witch Project, it probably isn't going to make a lot of money. It's just a stepping stone to your next script and to getting assignments and so forth. So again, I don't mean to be, depressing about how hard it is, but it is brutally hard, and it takes a long time. And the vast majority of money I make is from screenwriting assignments rather than doing my own spec scripts. So even on a day where I might write for 12 hours, it's probably going to be 12 hours of writing somebody else's scripts. To give you an example, I just finished writing a screenplay for a $30 million feature film for a Chinese studio. They wanted to do an English language feature film. And they reached out to me through a friend of mine in the industry. And that was a 1.5 year long assignment, just doing that one script, because it's animation to begin with. And it's flying to China and then flying here. And it just went on and on and on. And those were oftentimes 12-hour days. So it really depends.
And what does your development process look like once you've finished a spec script? What do you do with it? Do you have a bunch of trusted writer friends that you send it to? How do you go about getting notes and then implementing their notes? And we can talk specifically about a spec, just because we're talking a little bit about Get Married or Die.
Right. Well, usually what I do is my process is I have about a half a dozen or so contests, screenwriting contests that I have over the years determined, at least to my satisfaction, are good contests. And by good contests, I mean not necessarily that they're the most famous contests around, but what I'm saying is contests that are really looking at real world screenplays. Because I have to tell you that I have two scripts in development, and then I just got Get Married or Die, and none of those scripts won a major contest. And they did well in some of the smaller contests, but those, because I handpicked those contests, because my experience told me that they were really looking at real world screenplays, not necessarily art house screenplays, but screenplays that could make money, that could appeal to commercial producers. Because unless you're producing your own film, you really are depending on people betting their own money or their investors' money on your screenplay. So what I did was I picked about a half a dozen of those contests, and with every script, spec screenplay, once I've rewritten maybe a dozen times at least or more, and I find that if I do anything more to it, I'm actually harming it because it's as honed as it can be. I'll send it out to all 6 of those contests. And then while I'm waiting for those results to come back, I'll start my next assignment or my next spec screenplay. And I try not to wait, sit on pins and needles waiting for it. And then when they do come back, I really genuinely look at the results. And I always look for contests that give feedback. Sometimes you have to pay extra for that. And so I look at the feedback and I look for some continuity between all of the contests in terms of the feedback and the results. So if out of 5 out of the 6 contests I finish in the quarterfinals or better or win, then I know that I've got something that is probably good enough to submit to the industry. But I never submit to the industry before going through that, because one of the things that I always tell beginning writers is you're always going to think your first script is the greatest script ever written. I did. Everybody does. But the problem is if you submit it to producers or agents, those agents will log that script in before they read it, if they do read it at all. And if it's a bad script, you then become the writer who wrote that bad script. And if you go back to those producers and want to submit another script, they'll go back in their computer logs, see that you've submitted something else that they really hated, and you're going to have a real hard time and you're going to build a bad reputation. So I think the contest, screenwriting contest, although the contests themselves don't necessarily generate enough publicity, except for maybe 2 or 3 of the very biggest, to get you anywhere, but it does prep you and help you build your resume to say, okay, in contest XYZ, I was a quarterfinalist, I was a semifinalist here, I won here, and so forth. And then when you submit your resume with a script, there's a certain validity to your submission and a certain credibility that gives. So I am very much in favor of submitting to screenwriting contests, even if they don't directly get you anything. It's a way of validating and verifying your script, and of padding your resume and giving you a little bit more, and also gives you a realistic appraisal of where you are in your career. So for all those reasons, that's the first thing I do after I've finished the script.
Okay, perfect. And I just want to touch, well, actually, going back on that, do you mind mentioning a few of those specific contests that you enter? If you just off the top of your head could name a few.
Sure. The last one that I won was the Austin Revolution Film Festival down in, surprisingly, Austin. And it's the smaller version of the Austin, with the bigger, much bigger and better known Austin Film Festival. But it's really gotten a really high profile now among indies, the indie world, independent world. And I submitted a script down there that's now in development. It was called Chasing Spielberg, and it won the Director's Choice Award. And that's a contest. The other one, another one that I really liked is Action on Film, which is somewhere that I've had several scripts win there. And the reason I know that those two, as an example, are good contests is that after I won there, the scripts went on to do something. Both Chasing Spielberg and FaceTime, which is the script that I mentioned, is in development in Canada right now with a $4.5 million budget. Both of those won at Action on Film, and of course Chasing won at Austin Revolution. So those are two great contests right off the top of my head that I can say, definitely are worth submitting to. And of course, you got the bigger ones like Final Draft and Page and so forth. I have done well in those to a certain extent, but I just kind of found that for my particular style of writing, they didn't seem to be as open. And so when I found contests that were a little more commercial in nature, those scripts did well and then went on to do well commercial.
Okay, perfect. So you mentioned that you had written some books on screenplay structure. I'm a big fan of Blake Snyder. I've certainly read Sid Field, and those are two sort of real classic screenplay structure books. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your own book, and maybe even some additional lessons, and you can mention that too, and I'm happy to link to it in the show notes too, so people can maybe check that out. But what is sort of your take on Blake Snyder and Sid Field, and then what is your sort of unique twist on screenplay structure?
Well, I always tell everyone, whether it's in an audience or readers or just people who contact me on the web and ask me for advice, which I try to do. I can't always, of course, because I'm just swamped with work and both my own and other people's. But what I usually say is that there's no set way to write. That you have to kind of, although there are certain truisms in the film industry and in screenwriting. You can, if you're brilliant enough, you can write a script that breaks every single so-called rule in Hollywood and make it work. And there's a big thing now that they're starting to call the one-act screenplay, which is that screenplay that's more of a sketch than an actually structured story. Lady Bird is an example where really nothing really much happens, and it's really more of a character study than it is a structured story, with act breaks and escalating tension and jeopardy and all those kind of things that we tend to associate with most scripts. But although they're not, to be honest, they're not my particular taste in movies. I recognize that the fact that you can basically break all the rules and have a commercially and critically successful movie is very important to know. And so what I find is of all the books I've read, and I've read Linda Seeger, and I've read the Cat books, I've read most of the books out there. And I think that, as with most people, you end up picking one or two books that just appeal to who you are as a person, your personality, your work habits, your genre, and so forth. My personal favorites, aside from my books, are John Truby, and actually Vicki King wrote a great little book called How to Write a Movie in 21 Days. And those are actually the only two books that I personally ever suggest, not because I denigrate any of the other books, but I just love the simplicity of it. And because I'm, again, talking about personality, my personality is towards structure. And both of those books are heavy on structure. So, and they're detailed about structure. And they actually go through step by step. I think Truby has something called the 22 steps. And they actually bring you through it. And of course, as you get better and more experienced as a writer, you don't tend to stick to a specific structure and do it step by step anymore. But when you're building a house, you probably want to, intern with somebody who knows how to build a house with walls and floors and ceilings and all of those things, and boring nails and boards and all of those things before you build a geodesic dome. And although the geodesic dome may be your ultimate goal, you probably should know about structure and load-bearing things and all of that. Same thing with screenwriting is I think it's good to get books on the basics of screenwriting, hone your craft, and then when you have the skill to, veer off in your own direction and do a Donnie Darko, and there's a film that I think is just brilliant. And I don't know if there's a rule in that film, but if there is, I missed it. But it's a great example of how, when you have the skill, you can write any way you want. But it's kind of like Picasso. There's a great story about how Picasso's father was a painter, an art teacher, and Picasso learned everything he needed to know about traditional painting. Perspective and shadow and color and all of those things, and then drew a woman with 3 breaths on the left side of her face. But it was, he really came from a place where everything he did that broke rules, it wasn't an accident. It was a conscious choice that he was going to create a painting of someone that wasn't anatomically correct, maybe flat without perspective, with different colors, not realistic colors, and all of those things. And I think that because it was a conscious choice based in an actual knowledge of painting, it wasn't an accident. He could reproduce it, and it came across as, instead of being accidental, instead of people saying, oh, this guy doesn't know how to paint, they said, oh, this guy's a master of taking regular painting and taking it to logical extremes that we couldn't even imagine beforehand. So for me, that's the truth.
Perfect. So you mentioned some of your other projects. What is next on the docket for you?
A movie called FaceTime, okay. Which is in Canada, with a production company up there called Bruised Productions. And I love the name because being a screenwriter for I'm going on 30 years now, I do feel bruised. He's a wonderful Irish fellow. And he read the script, loved it, and he's going to be shooting it in my home province of Nova Scotia, where I was born, not where I grew up, but where I was born. And I'm just very excited by it. So that's got a $4.5 million budget. It's got European money already committed, and I'm working with the director right now on making changes, those horrific changes that every screenwriter has to make. And compromise on, when you, because that's the other thing too, is screenwriters go, oh, I've sold my script, I've made it. Oh yeah, right. Little do you know, the process has only begun, and they're going to take you through oftentimes very beneficial changes, but still, when you think that you're done with the script and you find out that a quarter to a half of it is going to change, you get a real understanding of what the whole collaborative aspect of the film industry is, and that is that once the director comes on board, in this case she is the boss, and although it's a back and forth and it is collaborative, you do have to realize that somebody's betting $4.5 million of their investors' money into this, and you'd better damn well listen and not be a prima donna, because this, if I wanted to be a prima donna about it, this could be the last script I ever sold.
Mm-hmm. And you're chuckling as you say, 25 or 50% of the script may change, and I wonder just how you are able to accept that or live with that. I mean, what happens when? And we don't have to talk about FaceTime specifically as a project, but I know there must have been times in your career where the producers are coming at you with notes that you just completely disagree with. How do you get yourself just mentally in a spot where you can still go back and try and actually execute what the producer is asking for, even though you in your heart of hearts feel like it's a terrible, terrible idea?
Well, I'm chuckling again because I'm thinking of Storefront, which was the script that was the title of the script for Get Married or Die, when one of the first companies to option Storefront after I wrote it, and it got a lot of buzz right away because it was a $100,000 script. They were these wonderful two guys, and they'd never produced a script before. They were both industry guys, and they did different things. One guy was an animator, I think, and the other guy was a really, really good DP, director of photography. And they started working with me on making changes. And it started off as, I think it was like a 110 or 115 page script. And it ended up as a 70-page script. And they just cut, oh my God, I was bleeding all over my laptop. And by the end of it, they looked at it and they said, oh, well, we don't like it anymore. And it took months to get there. It took months to get to the point of cutting killing my children, my literary children, cutting everything out, getting down to it, knowing as I did it that I was cutting out the funny, cutting out the dramatic, cutting out the connections, cutting out the flow, all of that stuff. But at that point, especially, even though I was kind of a veteran and I'd done a lot of scripts and I'd had a lot of scripts optioned and won some contests and been paid some good money to write and rewrite scripts for other people. So I had a certain status, not a lot, but a little bit of status. Even with that, because it was the first script that ever sold, oh my God, I was not going to be the one that was going to ruin it by objecting to anything that they said. And so in a way, it was probably my fault in that I just went with everything they said instead of making it a compromise between them, a negotiation over, what stayed and what didn't, and tried to make up for, explain my point of view. And then if they were persistent enough, do what they wanted, but certainly put up a little bit of a fight and a little bit of an argument, but without being a prima donna. And and then when I met Michael Feinstein, the director and producer of Get Married or Die, he was, oh my God, he was so good to work with. He really was. And it's funny because English isn't even his native language, but he had a real gut instinct for what worked and didn't work in the script. And so when I started, and he had most of all, and it's not that he had a respect for me, although he did, but that's not what was important. What was important was he had a respect for the script. So when a writer, I think, when writers kind of object to not being respected in Hollywood, it's really more that they're angry that the screenplays aren't respected. And Michael Feinstein is a perfect example of somebody who did respect the screenplay, did have to have changes made, part of it for casting, because when you cast on a $100,000 budget, he was lucky he got an amazing cast for this movie. But and every time somebody comes new on board, you got to go, well, how do we accommodate their age, their race, their gender, whatever, their acting style, what they can, their range, and so forth. And then, of course, when they found that the only place that they could afford to shoot a $100,000 movie in was a church basement that was cluttered with junk. It looked like a junkyard in there. It's amazing when you look at the film. You would never, ever think that that's where this was, except that intentionally in the film, they left one pile of debris and said that they were renovating the store. And it made for a nice scene where they're kind of chasing around the debris, the old man with the gun. So it actually ended up working well. But if you look at that, you'd never understand that that pile of debris filled the entire basement before they did this. So of course we had to make changes. They made it because of when they thought the film would be released, they wanted to make it happen at Christmas time. So we changed it so he was a photographer doing Christmas photos. All of the things that changed in the script all added to the script. And if it didn't, I'd talk with Michael and he would see my point of view and we would leave it alone. But that's an idealistic situation. And I really thank Michael for that. And I hope that he hears this, because generally what happens is you're kind of at the mercy of the people who are putting the money up to do your script. And you're always conscious of, not stepping on anybody's toes, because maybe they'll never hire me again. They'll never buy another one of my scripts, or word will get out that I'm hard to work with. So it's a real balancing act.
Yeah. So I've been just asking guests at the end of interviews lately what they have seen that they've really liked. There's a lot of great stuff on TV these days, but maybe you can just mention a couple things that you've seen that you really enjoyed watching.
I just saw Ready Player One, and I really quite liked it. I don't think I'd call it a great film, but it was very, very entertaining. And it was mind-blowing, especially somebody in the film industry knowing or having some small idea of what went into making a film like that. Step one in that film would have blown my mind and sent me home. I would never have been able to make that film. You know, I'm not sure I could have made my own films, to be honest. As a screenwriter, I can write the screenplays, but I don't think I have the wherewithal, the patience, and the gumption to actually do what's necessary to make a great film. But of the ones I've seen lately, I'd say that was my favorite in quite a while.
Perfect. How can people see Get Married or Die? Do you know what the release schedule is going to be like for it?
It's already released. It went straight to video. It's you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on iTunes, probably a lot of other places, but certainly if you want to make sure. You could actually even see the trailer on YouTube, and the trailer contains a link for you to be able to buy it off of, I can't remember whether it's iTunes or Amazon, but you can certainly get it those two places. And the cast is tremendous. The directing, and I want to say too that Michael Feinstein is a first-time director on this. And what he did with this film with $100,000, actually everything all in, after it was all said and done, it ended up costing about $300,000 with post and music and sound and all of that. But for a $300,000 movie, wow, I think he did an amazing job.
Perfect. What's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing? Twitter, Facebook, a blog, anything you're comfortable sharing, you can just tell us that now and I'll put it in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, look up Rob Tobin or Robert Tobin on Facebook, LinkedIn. You can go to my site, which is Surf City Films. Surf is in surfing. surfcityfilms.net. And you can see the latest things I'm involved with there, and there's links there to my various projects, films that have gotten done, and so forth.
Perfect, perfect. Well, Rob, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me today. Congratulations with this movie, and I look forward to having you on in the future when you get done some other films.
Thank you. It was quite an honor.
Perfect. We'll talk to you later.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
A quick plug for the SYS Screenwriting Analysis Service. It's a really economical way to get a high-quality professional evaluation on your screenplay. When you buy our 3-pack, you get evaluations at just $67 per script for feature films and just $55 for teleplays. All the readers have professional experience reading for studios, production companies, contests, and agencies. You can read a short bio on each reader on our website, and you can pick the reader who you think is the best fit for your script. Turnaround time is usually just a few days, but rarely more than a week. The readers will evaluate your script on 6 key factors: concept, character, structure, marketability, tone, and overall craft, which includes formatting, spelling, and grammar. Every script will get a grade of pass, consider, or recommend, which should help you roughly understand where your script might rank if you were to submit it to a production company or agency. We can provide an analysis on features or television scripts. We also do proofreading without any analysis. We will also look at a treatment or outline and give you the same analysis on it. So if you're looking to vet some of your project ideas, this is a great way to do it. We will also write a logline and synopsis for you. You can add this logline synopsis service to an analysis, or you can simply purchase this service as a standalone product. As a bonus, if your screenplay gets a recommend or a consider from one of our readers, you get to list that screenplay in the SYS Select database, which is a database for producers to find screenplays and a big part of your SYS Select program. This is a new service, but we've already got producers in the system looking for screenplays. And in fact, we already had our first success story, which was episode 222, Steve Deering, a couple of weeks ago. So check that out. He actually optioned a script through this new database. As a further bonus, if your script gets a recommend from one of our readers, your screenplay will get included in our monthly Best Of newsletter. Each month we send out a newsletter to producers that highlights the best screenplays that have come through our script analysis service. This is a monthly newsletter that goes out to our list of over 400 producers who are actively looking for material. So this is another great way to get your material out there. So if you want a professional evaluation of your screenplay at a very reasonable price, check out www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. On the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Canadian screenwriter Brandon Rhinus. It's another inspirational interview. Brandon was working a day job about 5 years ago and just really committed to writing. He started with writing and producing his own comic books, and then he started writing screenplays about 3 years ago, and now has a half dozen projects in various stages of development, including some films that are in the latter stages of post-production. And he's making a full-time living as a screenwriter up in Canada. So it's a great story story about how one person with talent, drive and determination, he found some success in the business. So I think it's a great interview and a really inspirational story. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Rob. I don't want to spend a ton of time parsing what Rob just said. I mean, you can hear him in his own words. There was a lot of great advice. I think his advice on shorts is excellent. I mean, they just make you better. Don't get too caught up in this idea that they have to go viral in order for them to be success. I mean, just doing a short, going through that process will make you a better writer. I thought it was also fascinating to hear his explanation of how he uses contests. I never had heard it quite worded that way, but I think he's spot on with that. Again, I think people just put too much emphasis on this idea of sort of winning and jump-starting your screenwriting career, as opposed to, using the contest for what they're good at, which is getting some feedback from third-party people, getting some validation. That's just all great stuff. And don't get too caught up again in this idea that, well, what happens if I win the contest, or how much money am I going to win, or, who do I get meetings with, or what do I get? Do I get an agent? All of these things, they are small pieces to a larger picture. And that larger picture is your career as a whole. And all of these little things, these smaller contests, they're going to add up. They're going to give you validation. They're going to give you just confidence to kind of move to that next level. And I think what Rob is doing is so smart. And again, I'd never heard it quite worded that way. So I think that's a great tip for all of us. I also think really listen to what he said about the different contests. I think he mentioned Action on Film. That was actually a contest that I entered the pinch into. I'm not sure if I've been rejected from that contest or not yet, but Rob's point is a really valid one. The really high-end contests, the Nichols and stuff, those contests are going to be much more about sort of the expression of writing and sort of the really high-end dramas and those kinds of projects, whereas some of these smaller festivals, they might be more sort of interested in genre fare. And that sounds like what Rob writes. And so he's gone out and found contests that would appreciate what he's trying to write. Because, and just as an example, a movie like Taken, the Liam Neeson movie, I thought it was a very good movie. Obviously, it was very successful, made a ton of money, but I don't think a script like that is ever going to win the Nichols or some of these more prestigious contests, just because it's a very elevated genre piece, but because it's sort of an action movie, a genre piece, those are not they're not the prestige projects. They're not the Academy Award winning projects, and those are a lot of the high end contests. They try and concentrate more on sort of these prestige projects. Again, the dramas, the high end dramas, the period pieces, those kinds of projects that aren't necessarily something that's ever going to get produced, but maybe would work as a good writing sample. So understand what you're writing, understand what films you like, understand, where those people are that might appreciate what you're writing, because every script is not a good fit for every producer or every contest. And you've got to understand that. And it doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's not well written. It just means it's not a good fit. So think about that. Again, I just really want to thank Rob. I thought that was a very, very inspirational interview. Who really gave us some great information, was very candid to us. So I really appreciate anybody who's willing to come on here and just, be honest and really tell their story. So congratulations to Rob for all of his success, and hopefully people listening to this can be inspired and find their own success. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.